Great. Um, so I want to change our view. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're right at 11 o'clock, and I think our room monitor will take care of making sure that everyone is muted. So let me say a little bit about myself, and then my co-presenter will introduce herself. I'm Nona Wilson. I'm a core faculty in the counseling program at Northwestern University, and I've been a counselor educator for about 27 years. I currently split my time between teaching in our master's level clinical mental health program at Northwestern and then running a private practice here in Evanston, Illinois.
Hi everyone, I'm Caitlin Luetger-Schlewitt, and I'm a graduate student in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling program at Northwestern. I've been an educator for the last 10 years, and I work with Dr. Wilson as her graduate assistant.
And we're both really happy to be here. It's our first time participating in the conference, and it's wonderful to have a chance to present. When we looked at the theme of the conference, which is around destigmatizing mental health issues, we thought that was wonderful for us coming out of a psychodynamic counseling program, because it really resonates with the value of contemporary psychodynamic work, which really could be thought of as destigmatizing work on an individual level to come to know and accept one's full self. So the theme of the conference resonated with us, and what we decided to do was to talk about one of the basic sort of building blocks of psychodynamic work, which is the way in which we protect ourselves through defenses. So we thought about the way in which that sort of cuts across diagnostic systems. So whether you're using the DSM, the ICD, or the PDM, defenses are at play and can be an important part of how we conceptualize what's happening with people. And in fact, a lot of what brings people into treatment that's identified as the problem is actually their attempt at a solution, which is their defenses at work. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And at the beginning, what we want to do is have you take a look at some examples. So I'm just going to call that up and give you a moment to look at that. So you might hold these examples in your head. Think about what you identify here as potential defenses at work, as well as your reactions to them. To begin our exploration of defenses, I want to start by recognizing that the concept of defense mechanisms originated with psychoanalytic thinking. And over time, that concept moved into general clinical practice. So counselors of all stripes might think about and talk about defenses, and even recognize that defenses originated in a psychodynamic framework without fully understanding that framework. But it's a widely used concept. It's familiar, or at least it's invoked in a lot of clinical settings. And then from there, the concept really permeated popular culture, right? So we have references in literature, film, art, it's a term that lots of people are familiar with, but as the concept migrated from psychodynamic circles or community into the wider public, the concept eroded and was somewhat distorted. And where that becomes important for us is that because counselors coming into training programs, of course, come out of the general public, they may come into training programs having an influence in their thinking about defenses by that sort of negative view from the general public. So we wanted to start with a brief discussion about some of that popular conception of defenses.
Yeah, and I can speak from experience as a graduate student coming into a program that's psychodynamic from the general public and having the ways that I thought about defenses kind of distorted in a sense. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Some of the ways that I had thought about defenses before I started learning about psychodynamic theory was that they were negative, and I always associated, like aggression or fighting, the phrasing like, oh, don't be so defensive. Why are you so defensive right now? And it's easy to kind of have some negative associations with defenses because of the fact that we experience them in our personal relationships with people. So we might have a situation where someone is, displaying a defense mechanism and we're observing them and we see what they're doing and it doesn't make sense to us. And so we think, I don't like that, or that's weird and it doesn't make any sense. But we're always going to encounter these in clinical work. And so sometimes clinicians are trained just to kind of like spot, point them out, and then they think they have to challenge the defenses. And some defenses should be challenged, but not all of them need to, because some are actually positive. So when we are going to challenge them, we want to be intentional in the way that we're doing that. And so one of the ways that we can make sure that we're being intentional with how we work with our defenses is to develop a more informed view of them.
Thank you, Caitlin. Sorry about that. I accidentally forwarded the slides, but you managed to get through your content, so I apologize for that. So let me talk a little bit about the goals and limits of our presentation today. When we thought about doing this, we recognize that we would likely have a mixed audience, people coming who have a great deal of knowledge about psychodynamic work, as well as those who don't have much at all. And we made the decision to really gear the program, the workshop, toward those of you who are new to psychodynamic thinking. So our primary target audience is folks who don't have a psychodynamic background. And what we want to do is introduce you to a more fully developed account of defenses, and then to spend some time talking about how that more elaborated understanding can increase clinical insight. So your ability to really appreciate your client's experience, especially your client's experience from the inside, and how doing that can increase empathy. And those two things together can then strengthen therapeutic alliance. And then near the end, we will talk briefly about working with defenses. So to really get us going here, we thought it would be useful to make a distinction between two concepts that sometimes get confused because they're quite similar, but from our point of view, they are distinct. So what we're talking about here is the distinction between defense mechanisms and coping strategies. So you'll see in the chart in front of you on the left-hand side a list of 3 defenses. There are many defenses and varying agreement about what should be on that list of defenses. We've selected just 3 common defenses that you likely have heard about, and then their corresponding coping strategy. So the first one is denial, which we see as a failure to see, recognize, or understand the existence or meaning of an internal or external stimulus. So essentially deleting or negating something that is unbearable.
And the coping strategy that goes along with that would be minimization, which is an attempt to solve the problem by assuming the problem is not as important as other people think it is.
Projection, which is in very simple terms, taking something that's intolerable that originates inside me and getting it out of me and putting it into another person.
Okay. And the corresponding coping strategy would be blaming, which is, you know, blaming someone else or blaming the system for what's been going on.
And then we can think about identification, the defensive identification, as the opposite of projection. It's taking something that's desired or valuable that exists outside of me and bringing it in as if it's mine.
And that goes along with replacement, which is solving the problem by improving weaknesses or limitations that exist either in yourself or in the situation that you're in. So literally replacing in that case.
So you can see as we talk about them, they're quite similar and it's easy to get them confused. And often they are referred to in sort of interchangeable ways, but there are important distinctions, right? They both are getting activated by something that is distressing or agitating for the person. And they're both functions to try to reduce anxiety. But they are different from each other. So with defense mechanisms, what we want to really keep in mind is that we don't choose or decide to use a defense mechanism. It is operating on an unconscious level. So it's outside of our awareness. Its activation is involuntary on the part of the person who is using a defense, and they are using it without conscious effort.
Right. And conversely, coping strategies are things that are conscious. We're aware that we're doing them and we do them voluntarily. And so usually we're making a voluntary action to either ignore whatever the anxiety is, find a solution to the stressor. And sometimes we might even seek out help from others to help cope with that situation.
And unlike coping mechanisms that Caitlin has just described, defense mechanisms are actually operating without conscious intention. Again, I don't choose to do it. I don't decide to do it. It is activated outside of my awareness. And the goal of the defense mechanism really is about changing an internal state. So the defense mechanism functions to change the way we see, feel, or interpret something. And while it changes the internal state quite effectively, it may have no bearing on external reality, right? It may not change the thing that could be emanating from the external environment that's distressing.
And coping mechanisms or coping strategies are really focused on just managing or solving a problem through those conscious behaviors.
Defense mechanisms, we believe, to unfold over time developmentally.
Right. And we learn our coping mechanisms through, you know, various resources. We might learn it through a family member. We might learn it by looking up an article on the internet on how to cope with something stressful, but it's something that we learn.
And finally, we consider defense mechanisms to be less adaptive. Although they perform an adaptive function, they are considered less adaptive than coping mechanisms, partly because they're not under conscious control, and often because they have a higher price tag associated with them. They are solving a problem, but they're also creating a problem.
And coping mechanisms are the opposite. They're considered more adaptive and less costly. So there's less consequence that might come out of them.
But it is important to remember that both of these exist along a continuum, right? We can have more useful defense mechanisms. We can have less useful coping strategies. Right? Both are along a continuum. So as we move further into talking about defense mechanisms, we realized that it's hard to, one, it's hard to do this in 50, 55 minutes. So everything we're doing is really sort of an introduction, which we hope will sort of whet your appetite for learning more about this and help you see how it can be useful to your clinical work. But we didn't want to just sort of cherry pick defenses out of the psychodynamic framework, because it's hard to fully appreciate the concept or make use of it without having some understanding of some associated psychodynamic concepts. So in true oversimplification and in rapid time, I'm going to introduce some important psychodynamic concepts, but in obviously very abbreviated form. So the first one is the dynamic unconscious. And right away, as soon as we start to talk about defenses in this way, there is an assumption of a dynamic unconscious. We can't have defenses in the way that we're defining them without accepting the notion of a dynamic unconscious. So they're predicated on that idea. And for today's talk, we could really just think about the dynamic unconscious as representing the way in which there are known and unknown aspects of ourselves. And the dynamic unconscious is the unknown. But I want you to hold that idea of known and unknown aspects in your head as we go forward. The second piece is Freud's structural model, which probably all of you are familiar with, this notion of the superego, the ego, and the id. And we're especially interested in the ego because defense mechanisms really are ego defense mechanisms. They are coming to the aid of a weak or overwhelmed ego that is having to, you can see in this list, it's situated between the superego and the ego. And it's having to manage the demands of the outside world, which are often internalized through the superego, and the needs and desires originating within us. So there are a lot of demands made on the ego, and at times it's overwhelmed, and the defenses come in as a kind of invisible army to support and protect the ego. The next piece is object relations. And for today, how we're going to think about object relations is simply the way in which we bring the outside in, right? So we have known and unknown, we have outside, inside. And all of us through our life bring the outside experiences in, they become part of us, and we carry them forward into new experiences. Then we have transference and countertransference, and they're versions of the same thing. And for today, we're really thinking about them as past and present, and the relationship between past and present. Transference is the way in which, in a flash, our experiences in the past can be activated, and it can seem as if what's happening in the present is like what's happened in the past, right? So we've got these sets of dichotomies, or what are often thought of as dichotomies: known and unknown, inside, outside, past and present. And all of those are at play with defenses. And all of that comes together to create this concept that's really important in psychodynamic work, which is developmental continuity. That things that are happening now, even if it doesn't seem on the surface to make sense, will make sense when we think developmentally, when we think about the person's history. Okay, so those are our frame. Now let's really talk about defenses. And in this image, what we're trying to do is visually represent the way in which we tend to see the top layer, the defense, and to talk about defenses as if they are only that top layer. But whenever there is defense, we know there is anxiety. There is something that is unbearable, unmanageable for the ego, and the defense is activated to cover it, to hide it, to keep it at bay. So when we talk about defense, we are talking about defense always paired with anxiety or pain. So then the logical question is sort of, well, why might we have anxiety? Where is that coming from? How is that getting triggered? Sometimes in situations that seem on the surface fairly benign. Here we might make use of Malin's triangle of conflict, and it's just a visual depiction of what we've been talking about, the way anxiety prompts the defense. But underneath the anxiety are feelings or impulses that can be triggered either internally or externally. They start to bubble up, and they are unacceptable or too frightening for the ego to manage. It creates a lot of anxiety, and the defenses essentially come to the rescue, but at times the rescue has a big price tag associated with it, right? So I'm not sure how I go back. So let me go back here for a moment. So then, we go from defense to anxiety. Why anxiety? These feelings and impulses, and then we might think, well, why are feelings and impulses so threatening? Why couldn't we just know them on a conscious level and deal with them? So one of the things we think about is that defenses have historical roots, and whether or not a feeling or an impulse feels unacceptable, unmanageable, has to do with our history. So, sorry about that. Oh, I still can't get it right. There we go. So here we're really very quickly talking about concepts from object relations, right? The self that needs to be protected begins instantly, right? We're born into the world with a kind of incipient or emerging self that is not fully formed and is waiting for an interaction with the outside environment to form. And it's that mix of the temperament, the dispositions, all of those things that we are born into the world with, and how that is received by the environment. We could spend an entire course of study talking about concepts related to object relations, but in just a moment or two, what I'm trying to convey is that these early life experiences really matter, and they are formative in terms of what kinds of feelings or internal experiences, external experiences can overwhelm a person, right? Even in an ideal caretaking environment, there are numerous misattunements between caretaker and infant. And those misattunements are frightening for the infant. And the infant comes into the world sort of preloaded with ways of signaling distresses. And as we'll talk about later, that biological preloading is a precursor for later defense mechanisms.
And so what Dr. Wilson is describing with these experiences is something that happens before we develop our language. And so babies and toddlers, infants, toddlers, they're not able to conceptualize the self the same way as we might as adults. And so what's happening is all of these memories are basically being recorded without words. And so we're left with sensations, and we're left with a non-contextual memory. And so what we're talking about is our implicit memory. It's our unconscious memory, and it doesn't have the contextual narrative attached to it. And this implicit memory gets triggered a lot faster than our explicit memory. And so when that happens, it overwhelms us with an emotional response. And we're not talking about trauma right now, but there's this really great quote from van der Kolk that gets popularized as trauma is a reaction, not a memory. And we can think of defenses in the same way. We might have a reaction to something, but we don't always have the contextual narrative there to explain why, or to know right away why we reacted with a particular defense. And the other point I want to bring up here is that if we think back to some of the stigma or misunderstandings about psychodynamic theory, sometimes people imagine a situation in which we're just uncovering lots and lots of memories, and all of those memories are perfectly formed. They have, all of the context there, but that's just not how it works in practice. And so what we're looking at, or what we're more interested in, are those non-contextual sensations, like our feelings and our reactions and our defenses. And if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. And so when we think about these defenses, we want to think about them conceptually instead of as a list. And I know Dr. Wilson mentioned there's a pretty extensive list of defenses that exist out there. I have learned of at least 30 that exist, and I know there's more. But we want to think about what they actually are and how we can define them. So if we think back to Freud, Freud viewed defenses as an internal situation, and they're focused on your inner life and the internal pressure that you experience. And so you might internalize the societal expectations around you. And when your desires and your needs are in conflict with that, you're going to have some type of anxiety, and everything's happening inside of you. If we look to more contemporary views, it's expanded a little bit more to be focused on interpersonal factors and protecting the self. Ideally, or realistically, each definition is focused on the concept that defenses are involuntary, and they're just automatic responses. If you could go to the next slide, I want to look at just a few definitions. So what I have on this slide are 3 contemporary definitions about what defenses are. So the APA says they're an unconscious reaction pattern employed by the ego to protect itself from anxiety that arises from psychic conflict. Valent calls it a pathological or coping response to stress, and Quatman calls it what we do to stay away from the feelings of anxiety that we once felt or might feel in the present, because if we were to feel their full magnitude, ourselves might suffer damage and could even shatter. So the idea is these are things that we do involuntarily to protect ourselves from some form of anxiety. And I want to point out that Valent made a really great point that our defenses can be considered like the same way as we might get a fever when we're sick. We don't choose to get a fever, we just get a fever in response to being sick at the time. And then the final definition that I want to share with you guys is from Kramer, which is on my next slide. And this definition is really great because it kind of covers all of the main points that we're focusing on. So Kramer calls defenses unconscious mental mechanisms that are directed against both internal drive pressures and external pressures, especially those that threaten self-esteem or structure of the self, as might occur when friends or family fail to be empathic or in some other way are lost to the individual. The function of the defense mechanism is twofold: to protect the individual from experiencing excessive anxiety and to protect the integration of the self. So like I said, this really kind of pulls together the focus on the internal, the interpersonal, and then the self-protection element there. And so we've been talking about quite a few points right now. And we'd like to take a second to check in and touch base on what the key takeaways up to this point have been.
Great. So what we hope are the takeaways at this point is that despite the bad rap they get, defenses serve an important function for all of us, that we all need, have, and use defenses, and that the weaker the ego, the more overwhelming the stress that we're experiencing, the more likely defenses are to be activated. Clinically, we stay alert to defenses, not to attack them, not always or only to remove them, but really as signals of client distress. And in doing that, defenses allow us insight into clients' inner experience, which is what we're really seeking to fully understand and to help them understand. So when we encounter defenses, We want to recognize that there's anxiety that underlies that and to be responsive to the anxiety. When we do that, we think it's interesting to notice how shifting the way we think about defenses can change our therapeutic stance. So, Caitlin, I can't see anything but the slide. I'm not sure if at this point we were thinking we would take questions in the chat box. We're about midway.
Yeah, I can see the chat box. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to toss out there, that would be great. And I see a comment from someone that they cannot hear us. Is anybody else having trouble, or can you thumbs up if you can hear us? Okay, I see a thumbs up. All right, thank you. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat box.
So because I've shared my screen, I can't see the chat box at all.
Brian has asked, any recommended reading on learning more about this topic?
Absolutely. We've included some references, and at the end, we will also show again our names and contact information. And for folks who want to follow up and pursue it, we can make lots of recommendations. But the things in the reference list, I think, are really accessible in terms of how they're written.
Great. I see two more questions. How would you discern between resistance, defenses, and confrontive clients? Or confrontative clients. So how would you discern between resistance, defense, and confrontation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we also would want to see it in context, because confrontation can actually be used as a way of resisting, right? I can present myself in an adversarial, aggressive way, which is a form of resistance. And in many ways, we can think about, at least therapeutically, defenses that show up in session may all serve a kind of goal of resistance, right? I can be overly cooperative and resist. I can be confrontational and resist. I can stay in my head and be resisting, right? So partly what we're doing is paying attention to the function of the defense.
And then I see a couple more coming in. For those of us who are not psychodynamically trained, would you recommend not really touching these areas with our clients, or is it appropriate to do so in a conservative way?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And it's, you'll see our recommendations at the end are really around, we do need more training to deal with it. But there are ways that clinicians who aren't psychodynamic can appreciate that this is going on with their client and do things that are very useful to the client without getting into territory that we're not equipped to manage.
Okay, and there's a couple more. Is the ego or the id more responsible for the defense mechanism about? So is the ego or the id more responsible?
I don't really think of it in that way. I think of it as a mechanism that is defending the ego. It might get prompted by the id, right, or the superego. I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the question. Maybe we can come back to it at the end if we have a little bit of time, but I'm not sure I conceptualize it that way.
Okay, and then there's just two more that I see. Do open-ended questions and reflection of emotions or thoughts back to the client help to explore that resistance or even motivational interviewing?
Yeah, so these are great questions, and they really have to do with some of the recommendations we're going to make at the end around working with defenses. So let's hold on to that idea and come back to it at the end.
And then the last question that was there was, is there a way to discern which defenses, coping strategies are constructive and which are destructive? And that's something that we're going to talk about as well.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, what I would say is we do that in collaboration with the client, right? We are observing it, but it's through the relationship with the client and having them think about their experience as well, right? So we're not setting ourselves up to be the judge of that. Okay, so maybe because of time, we should move forward. So one of the things we had set as a goal for the presentation was to just introduce the idea of seeing defenses as a normative developmental process. So as I talked about just briefly earlier, we recognize that infants are in many ways preloaded with defensive equipment, right? We are all born with innate or reflexive behaviors to protect ourselves. And some of those behaviors continue into adult life, and some of them come under conscious control. But these early defensive reflexes like blinking, spitting, sucking, serve as a kind of biological prototype or precursor of mental defensive operations. So we're not really sort of going down the path of trying to map a defense on top of a reflex, but we can see that there are biological responses to threat, right? So blinking, something's coming fast at me, it's threatening, my eyes shut, and the object is no longer in my field of vision. I've protected my eyes, but I've also made the object disappear, right? So we might see that as a kind of biological prototype for denial. And the main point here is that we recognize those reflexes as not being decisions that we're making, but a protective response. And we can think about defenses in the same way. The other point I would make here is that the timing and availability of defense mechanisms is really determined in part by cognitive capacities that are coming online through development. And so when we are thinking about lifespan development and cognitive development, we could also be thinking about defensive development. And the defenses that are cognitively simple, that require less cognitive development, are, not surprisingly, going to be available earlier. And then more complex defenses that require greater cognitive capacity will emerge later. And Caitlin's going to talk a little bit more about this.
So we know that we need them. They develop across the span of our entire lifetime. And in a minute, I'm actually going to kind of touch on kind of the hierarchy of these defenses and the way that they might show up at different periods of our lives. But defenses are absolutely necessary for us to exist and function regularly in our lives. And Freud even said that the ego probably could not exist without defenses. And there's a quote on this slide from Kramer that says, "A heartbeat that is too rapid or too irregular may signal cardiac pathology, but having a heartbeat is a requirement for everyday living." And what we have this here for is to kind of speak to the point that defenses can be healthy and they can be pathological. When they're healthy, they're great for us, and they help us, function at a normal level. But when they start to become pathological, that's where we need to reassess and kind of see what needs to be done. The way that we can assess whether or not they're pathological has to do with a couple of factors, like our age and how we're using them. So if you could go to the next slide, a look at the different categories of defenses that exist. And so we're taking this from valence research and applying it to our research. Defenses and the categories, sometimes you'll see them listed differently. There are actually quite a few different ways of categorizing the defenses, but they exist kind of on a continuum of unhealthy, immature to more healthy, mature. So with this listing, if we look at pathological defenses, these are a little bit more on the severe end of a continuum. They have more severe consequences for the user, and you're more likely to see pathological defenses in somebody who is a child or somebody who's in a state of psychosis. If we go a little bit further, we'll see immature defenses, which are more common in adolescents, people who are substance abusers, and people with personality disorders. And you'll see defenses like acting out, dissociation, and projection here. The neurotic defenses are used to basically keep threats to the self outside of our awareness. And you'll see these coming through in phobias or compulsions. And they tend to be a little bit more comfortable for the person who is displaying them than the person who's observing them. And it's because it's keeping that, threat outside of their awareness. And the mature defenses are considered to be the healthiest defenses. And all mature or healthy defenses can also become pathological, but we develop these mature defenses as we age. So the older you are, the more likely you're going to have more mature defenses. And they allow a little bit more of our discomfort or the uncomfortable feelings associated with our defenses to come into our consciousnness. And so, like I said, the age matters. And the way in which they're used matters for how we look at them as healthy or pathological. As an example, denial is a defense that you might see in an adult, and that's considered to be unhealthy. But for a child, it's perfectly normal for a child to be using denial. Similarly, humor is considered to be a healthy defense, and you're making light of an uncomfortable situation, and that can be a really great way to handle something unpleasant. But if you are laughing hysterically at every terrible situation, then the defense might be becoming slightly pathological. And another way that we can think about them is the way in which they introduce distortion. So if you could go to the next slide. Defenses, regardless of what category they are or what type they are, they all introduce distortion, and it's a form of self-deception. And it's not a self-deception that we're consciously doing, we're aware, we're doing it on purpose. It's just happening involuntarily, and it ends up being a form of self-concealment. So we're hiding aspects of ourself from ourselves and from others, and it can come at a pretty high cost with varying consequences there. The way that we kind of conceptualize this distortion can be seen through the work of Lee and Reiser on the next slide, who came up with a model for how we take in information, process, and then react to experiences. And so they basically broke the personality up into 3 sections for input, processing, and output. And so at the input level, there's some type of perceived threat, and we, during the input phase, want to change that threat. So you might see some kind of defenses like denial, displacement, or projection. Then that threat's going to go into the ego subsystem, and our ego is going to try and process that. It's processing the danger or the anxiety or the stressful situation, and you're going to see defenses here like repression, rationalization, and intellectualization. And then at the output stage, this is our visible reaction to whatever that threat was. And so you might see defenses like, undoing or sublimation, carrying out action without thinking. And defenses are going to impact each one of these subsystems, but the output tends to be the most affected by the defenses, mostly because we can see what's happening there. And so when we look at the concepts of this distortion and we think about, the idea of pathological versus healthy defenses, the way that we experience these in the room can lead to implications for counselors.
So that's what we want to discuss next and sort of move into the final section of the presentation. Then we'll open up for questions. So to begin with, some of the implications of what we've been talking about. The first is that a psychodynamic framework, and especially defenses and the unconscious, should suggests to all of us that we are all unreliable narrators of our own experience, right? That there are parts of us that are unknown to us. They can become known, but there is a part of us that is unknown. And so it's not just that clients at times may willfully edit or select what they tell us, but there are times that parts of their experience are not available to them to articulate to us. So it means that our observation skills become really important. We need to pay close attention to what it is that's happening in the room. And we recognize that with defenses, they can only be inferred from indirect evidence, right? We're paying attention to what people do and what they say in order to get a sense of, is a defense activated? And that process inevitably is inexact. So what will help us? There are things that we can be paying attention to. Behavior that seems rigid, that seems like the client has little sense of control over it. They feel compelled to do it, or they must do it, but they are also unaware of doing it and the implications of doing it. We might also recognize that when the defense is blocked, the consequence of that is more anxiety for the client, and we can look for incongruities, right? So someone who is, on a more obvious level, someone who's smiling or laughing while recounting traumatic events, someone whose facial expression and voice tone and even the words they're saying really convey a lot of anger, yet they deny feeling angry at the time. So we're watching for signs and indirect indicators of defenses. Then in terms of working with defenses, what we did was sort of come up with three sections: things to remember, things to recognize, and responses. And we've tried to put all of these in fairly plain language and to tap into sort of common practice, micro skills, foundational helping skills. So in terms of things to remember, we want to remember that defenses will be part of therapeutic work.
We want to remember that the defenses support an overwhelmed ego, and so they're beneficial because they aid the functioning of the client.
They reduce anxiety.
They're not intentional, they are involuntary.
Not only are they involuntary, they are outside of awareness. So the client isn't choosing to do it and they are not aware that they're doing it.
Okay. Your own defenses can be activated by someone else's defenses.
And an additional piece here is we want to remember that it's not so much the presence of immature defenses, but the absence of mature defenses that is more problematic, right? Given enough stress, given enough overwhelm, we may all regress to and reach for early life defenses, which we would think of as more immature. It's over time, does the person show the capacity for more mature defenses, right? So that's one way of sort of paying attention to this.
And we want to recognize the indirect evidence of defenses.
So as we were just saying, rigid responses over which the client seems to have little control.
Incongruities may signal defenses at work. So if something seems off, there might be a defense coming into play.
And then we also want to pay attention to our own reactions. So defenses often will pull for certain kinds of responses. And I didn't include it in the reference list, but I would recommend the work of Paul Whittel and cyclical psychodynamics. He talks about this concept of enlisting accomplices, that our defenses tend to pull for certain kinds of responses from other people, and predictable responses, right? If the counselor responds the same way that everybody else in life has responded, it tends not to be therapeutic. So we want to pay attention to our own response. And this is where we need training, we need experience, and we need good supervision to learn how to manage our own responses. And then in terms of responding, empathy, 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 and not judgment.
We want to make sure that we are attending to the anxiety beneath the defense instead of necessarily focusing on just the defense that we see.
We also want to call upon our training in terms of paying attention to timing, pacing, and where we are in the relationship with the person. Is this the right time to try to notice and work with the defense?
Right? We want to think about the ideas of supporting the client versus uncovering. So if we think back to the way that we talked about implicit memory, and the things that we uncover with a client might not have that context. And so we might need to switch into support mode to help them cope with that defense.
Right, and so I would, the question that was in the box about people who don't have psychodynamic training and how to deal with this, I think this understanding that psychodynamic work includes both uncovering and supportive work. Often the attention goes to the uncovering work, but the supportive work is really important. And often clients need a combination of both of those. And for folks who don't have dynamic training, there's a lot that you can do that's dynamically helpful that resides in the supportive range. And what we're doing there is building and strengthening ego functioning.
Right. And we also want to consider how we can work to improve or strengthen coping strategies to help our clients as kind of the first step when working with their defenses.
We can also work indirectly with defenses by helping the client increase affect tolerance. So if you think back to that slide of the bubbling up feelings, if clients can begin to make room for their feelings slowly, gradually, with lots of support, so that those feelings aren't so overwhelming and threatening, there's less anxiety, there's less triggering of the defense. So working to increase affect tolerance, self-acceptance, and self-esteem are really important ways of working with defenses.
Mm-hmm. And this can help us assess the psychological mindedness and the self-reflective capacity of who we're working with.
Okay. I think that's the last of our content slides. Here's the reference slide. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I believe the conference organizers are making all of this available to you. We'll take questions. And while we're doing that, here's our contact information as well. And then I need to figure out how to stop sharing. Here we go. And I think we have just a couple of minutes here for questions, which I certainly am open to people unmuting themselves and asking a question or putting it in the box. Yeah, so some questions about the slides. You can certainly contact us. We're happy to mail them out to you, but I think they're also going to be available. And if we could, I came in early to the before the previous session had ended and heard that that presenter was asking for the chat transcript. And so if it's possible that Caitlin and I could get that, one, we can get your feedback. It is the first time we've done the presentation, so your feedback to us about what's helpful or what we might change would be great. And then we can also respond.
I see a question that just popped in that someone is asking, the id runs the pleasure center. Does anxiety that challenges the id prompt the id to bring forth defense mechanisms?
Well, it certainly prompts the unconscious to bring forth, but we don't want to imagine that the unconscious is only the it, and I think that's a common way that people think about it. Great. So somebody, Lori Ann, has given us the email that we need to get the slides to. So I'll make sure that we do that. And if everybody then would contact, I suppose, Danita Hudson at the Chicago School, you'll be able to get our slides. You can also email us directly.
Hey, this is Lori Ann. We're going to make sure that there's a public facing page that has all the presentations on it. So we'll get that information out to everybody.
Great, great. Thank you. Okay, we want to thank everybody for coming. We appreciated the opportunity to talk out these ideas with you, and thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.